My friend told me about this study they did a few years ago where they injected these beautiful redwood trees with a chemical similar to adrenaline, so that way the trees wouldn't go into hibernation. And these mighty trees that normally live for hundreds of years died within 1 year because they didn't have a season of wintering. And I think about us humans, the way we expect ourselves to be in constant spring, always blooming, always producing, always distracted, and not making time for those moments with the people we love or those moments with nature. Distraction is the death of art, but boredom is the birthplace of it.
Somebody near and dear to me shared that video with me recently. Apparently it was sort of making the rounds on social media. And one thing that was encouraged after watching the video was, we really need to take a break. Which, don't get me wrong, I can appreciate that sentiment. But after I watched that video, I thought, it just doesn't seem right to me. There's something off. First of all, when somebody starts a video by saying that a friend of mine recently told me about a study, and then they're going to go and make some conclusions, I'm already suspicious. So, and one conclusion that was made, and this is a quote, is that the tree or the trees died within 1 year because they didn't have a season of wintering. So, first of all, let's just say, for argument's sake, that somebody went around injecting chemicals into large protected trees, right? And then a year later they died. Okay, you could say they died because they didn't go through winter. You might also say they died because some kook was going around injecting them with some chemicals. I don't know. But other things come up too, right? Like, first of all, they're redwoods, and so they're evergreens. And so whether or not they, quote, hibernate is an interesting question. And again, claiming that, one thing caused another is a conclusion that you can't really make without some further testing. But you don't even have to do further testing if you wanted to sort of investigate the truth, right? There are other ways that you could go about trying to determine whether or not your gut about those claims might be real or not. You could ask an expert, certainly. I'm sure that a biologist or a botanist or an arborist could probably shed some light on the veracity of those claims. You could certainly try to go online yourself and try to do some research to find out whether or not that study that her friend referenced was real or true or even exists, right? And if there is a study that investigates those variables, you could look at the study itself and try and determine whether or not it was conducted in a manner that would lead to any kind of claims or conclusions. So you could do that too. You could even try it yourself if you could try and figure out what the chemicals were and what the how they were administered. And also, if you could get somebody to allow you to experiment on some protected, very large trees like redwoods, you could do that yourself. The reason why I'm starting this first informational video with a video that doesn't have anything to do with educational research is because, number one, I thought it was attention getting. It certainly got my attention when it was shown to me. But also it underscores really one of the fundamental kind of outcomes for the first part of the class, and that is, how do we know what we know? What are some of the different ways that we can go about investigating, in this case, investigating the truth? So that study doesn't have to do with educational research, but I will tell you my own story, a real story that happened to me in my life that I think is a good example of something real in education that can help frame the outcomes for this very first part of the class. And it was something that I'm sure I'm not alone in having this experience as an educator. When I was first starting to teach, my first teaching job was in a junior high school, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And I was very, very young when I started. And one of my first classes and assignments was to teach 8th grade life science. And I had never taught that grade level before. And again, I was young and I was a new teacher. And I taught in a really wonderful department, science department at this very, very large junior high school. And one of the teachers who I taught with also taught 8th grade life science. And one of the things I noticed really early on in my teaching, which I was very confident that I was going to be successful. I loved the subject area. I was always good working with kids. I always thought I had just kind of, I was cut out to be a teacher. I had the thing, right? Always felt that way. Well, when I started teaching, I had a lot of trouble with classroom management. And for those of you who are teachers now, I'm sure that's not an unusual thing to say, right? Or to realize. But one of the things that really got me was that another teacher in the classroom right next to me who taught the same class as me was a woman named Mrs. Govert. And she had more experience than me. I would say 10 years more experience, probably. But she didn't have anywhere near the kind of classroom management problems that I had. And I would observe her on my breaks, and sometimes our classes would be together for different things. But I watched her operate, and to me, it just didn't seem like she did things that differently than me. But she had way better control of her class, and consequently her classes and the lab experiences and everything that she did with them seemed to be more successful than mine, which really bothered me because I was a little competitive. I think I was overconfident. And also it just didn't seem like she did things that differently from me. And yet it was a completely different feel in her classroom. And so it really got me thinking, well, what are all of the possible reasons why I don't seem to be as successful as her and why I'm struggling with classroom management and she didn't seem to? So what are all the possible reasons? So I started thinking about all the variables that might be different between us. And of course, the first thing I thought of is that, oh, well, she just has better students than me. Which I liked to believe, and it's possible that classes are assigned and that teachers go in with more experience and they can identify students who they know are going to be successful in their classes and try to work with the schedulers and get those students in. But that was just wishful thinking on my part. I do not believe she had students that were any different than mine. So there was that. There was a gender difference. I was a male and she was a female. She also had a more commanding, just physically a more commanding presence than me. That's another variable. I wasn't that much bigger or taller or even that much older than some of my students. So it seemed like maybe I just didn't command the kind of the kind of respect or gravitas or whatever that the students would just innately be more obedient or less disruptive. So that there was that option. I tried to find out whether or not she was subscribing to a particular sort of model of discipline. I was adhering to a model called assertive discipline, and I really believed that it was going to be an effective model for me to use. But it seemed like we didn't do that many things differently in my observations. So those were some other, that the type of disciplinary model was another variable. She was a mom of boys, and I had not started a family yet. So I thought, well, maybe she just has more, either there's a motherly presence that kids are responsive to, or there are a bunch of little things that you learn and practice being a parent that do apply to being an effective teacher. So I had all of those variables for me to consider, right? And there were then different ways that I could go about trying to determine whether or not which of those variables might be affecting my abilities as a teacher. So one thing I did with my school district is I did have an expert come in and observe me. We had to be observed anyway. All the new teachers did, and we happened to have one person at my school who was assigned to be to provide really detailed analysis and evaluation. And one of the things that I really wanted this professional to look at was what I might be doing wrong from a disciplinary point of view. What was I doing something wrong in my behavior? So that was an option. Another option would be for me to investigate other models of discipline, look at models of that, whether they were videos or whether they were articles or whether there was a book on classroom discipline. So that was another option. And then another option would be me just testing things out myself, like deciding, hey, maybe this is something that I'm not doing consistently or that I'm not doing effectively, and I'm going to change that, and I'm going to monitor myself and see what happens. So at that point in my teaching, I became a scientist. I adopted scientific thinking rather than just giving up and saying, well, these kids are just awful and I'm not going to change. I'm just going to expect that they'll change or that I'll get a better class next semester or next year. But I adopted a way of thinking that involved investigating these variables that were important to me and trying to figure out what I could do to change those variables or the outcomes of those variables. So one of the things that you're going to be asked to do, in fact, the very first thing you're asked to do in part one of this class is to define the term observation and the term variable. And in my case, I was observing one of the variables of interest to me was student behavior in my class, actual like behavior management. So that was an important variable, and I observed it every day. I observed things that worked and that didn't. I observed behaviors that were good, any behaviors that I didn't like. Those are my observations, and in that case, I started to identify variables that might impact or affect student behavior. So a variable is just anything that's capable of changing or being changed or having a different value. And as you go through the course notes, you're going to note that I define these terms very, very clearly. Also know that the first objective for part one, define, observation, and variable, those are something that you're going to be tested over in this class. In exam number one. So study that part of the notes carefully. The second objective in this class is not something that you're going to be tested over, but it's something that you're going to use throughout the entire class, and that's that you should be able to describe common educational variables of interest. And they should be variables of interest that you care about and that you are interested in. Right now, I'm highly interested in how AI might be able to make a teacher's job more effective, and also help reduce the labor intensiveness of being a teacher. So I have a lot of variables of interest related to AI right now. So you don't have to just describe those on the exam, but the next objective on the list, 1.3, is that you should be able to describe how science represents a way of knowing and differentiate between science and other ways of knowing. And so again, asking an expert is another way of knowing. It's not necessarily science. It could be related to science in a way. But watching a TikTok video, even if there's an expert that you trust, you trust their authority, there's still a lot of editing and other things that could go on that could influence and affect whether or not the messaging is accurate. And there are other ways of knowing as well. There's even your own intuition, that's certainly a way of knowing. Another objective that you're going to be asked to address on the exam is to distinguish between basic and applied research. And I'll just give you an example from this scenario that I talked about. Applied research would be me trying out a new model of like classroom management, something different than I was already doing based on an actual model. So, and again, I was adhering to certain elements of a model called assertive discipline. I don't think I was doing it that well in the first year of my teaching, but that was a model. So trying to create a new approach and then implement it with my students and observe the effects, that would be an example of applied research. Basic research would be me as a scientist, would be me sort of possibly defining a behavior model, operationalizing it, or turning that model into actionable strategies for teachers, and then going about and very carefully testing each of those strategies and making hypotheses about them and in controlled environments. And so creating a behavior management model could be considered a basic form of research, but applying that model to some individual strategies that I might use as a practicing educator would be more applied. Now, also, I will say that when I had an expert come in and observe me and make observations while I taught, I was asking that person to evaluate me. They were assessing me initially, and by assessment I mean they were just recording observations. And the variables of interest that I was interested in them recording had to do with what I was doing to manage student behavior. And then evaluation would be kind of passing judgment on that, like what worked and what didn't work. What was I doing based on their expertise that seemed to be effective or not seem to be effective, and where specifically was I tripping up? So assessment is just making observations. Evaluation is putting some kind of judgment to them. And finally, in one of the things that you're going to be addressing in part one is examining the difference between the methods and procedures for evaluation versus research. And I will just summarize that. That could be a whole nother class, but I will just summarize that by saying that generally speaking, the models that you're going to be learning in terms of research in this class could be used for evaluation as well. And most evaluation models are really rooted in the same kinds of approaches. The only thing different about them is the purpose or the reason why you're doing them. Research represents investigations in which you are attempting to sort of generate new knowledge. Not just solve a problem for yourself, but generate new knowledge about an important variable of interest to you that could be used to help promote and advance education in general. Evaluation, you could do the exact same thing in terms of your investigations, but your purpose would be that you want to be able to draw some conclusions about yourself. In a particular situation, in your situation. You're not attempting to influence the field of education. You're attempting to influence your field of education. So those two terms might be used interchangeably at some points throughout the semester, but just know that the methods and approaches you're going to be learning about in terms of doing research are 100% applicable to doing evaluation studies as well. And in fact, in your job as a professional educator, you will likely focus almost exclusively on carrying out evaluation exercises, either for yourself or other teachers. If you wanted to carry out research investigations, then you might do that. You will do that if you decide to continue to go to school after earning a master's degree. And that's when you start to operate more scientifically. However, this is you are earning a Master of Science degree. And so all of these ways of thinking and these approaches to investigating variables of interest, solving problems using science, all of that is foundational to everything that you have been learning about in your program or will learn about. And so a class like this is absolutely foundational. And I believe it's foundational not just in your graduate program, but also in your professional practice, and perhaps most importantly, if you're in your life in general, so when you get the TikTok video or the Reddit posts or national leaders who say things and say, people are saying this, or a friend of mine told me about a study, When you hear things like that, you can immediately be suspicious, immediately be skeptical. So I believe this is a very relevant class for anybody who is a rational thinker.